How has your day been so far? Hello, we're AETA Stories, and today we're sharing a brand new original story with you. Mark Bennett announced the trip on a Friday evening as casually as if he were commenting on the weather. They would be driving out to his mother's place outside Toledo for the weekend. Just a couple of days, he said. She had jars of preserves to give them before winter, and she wanted to see them. That was all. Elizabeth paused in the doorway, keys still in her hand. She had not expected it. She already had plans for the weekend, small ones, nothing dramatic, but plans nonetheless. A quiet visit with a friend, errands she had postponed, a rare chance to let the days pass without obligation. She opened her mouth to say as much, then stopped. Mark was already watching her, eyebrows raised in that familiar way, not aggressive, not openly challenging, just enough to signal that disagreement would turn into something heavier than the subject deserved. "Of course," Elizabeth said instead, "if she wants us to come." The decision settled between them without further discussion. It often did. Over the years, Elizabeth had learned which moments were worth resistance and which ones only drained energy without changing the outcome. This felt like the latter. Her relationship with Helen Bennett had always existed at a careful distance. There had never been shouting, never open hostility. Helen was polite, restrained, and unfailingly correct. But beneath that politeness lived a quiet disappointment that was never spoken aloud. Years had passed without children, and though Helen never accused Elizabeth directly, the absence hung in every pause, every sideways glance, every well-meant question asked a little too often. Elizabeth endured it with the same calm she applied to most things, by not responding. That night, Mark came home later than usual. The smell of alcohol reached her before his voice did. He shrugged off his jacket, his movements loose, careless. When Elizabeth asked where he had been, he answered vaguely. A birthday at work, one drink too many, nothing worth worrying about. She suggested he go to bed early. The drive in the morning would be long. Mark waved the concern away, already irritated. He slept poorly anyway, restless and impatient, and by dawn his mood had only worsened. They left early, the sky still gray, the air sharp with cold. Mark insisted on driving, though Elizabeth noticed the stiffness in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened at nothing at all. He was tired, too tired. His answers to her quiet questions were short, clipped, and edged with annoyance. As the car merged onto the highway, Elizabeth stared ahead through the windshield, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Everything appeared normal. The road stretched forward, empty and familiar. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm of the drive, she felt a low, persistent unease, as if something unseen had already begun to shift. The farther they drove from the city, the quieter Mark became. At first, Elizabeth thought it was the lingering irritation from the early morning, the kind that usually faded once coffee and motion settled in. But as the miles passed, his silence took on a different quality, heavy, strained. His grip on the steering wheel tightened, then loosened, then tightened again. Once the car drifted slightly toward the shoulder before he corrected it too late. Elizabeth watched him from the corner of her eye. His blinking slowed. His head dipped forward just for a second, then snapped back up. "Mark," she said carefully, "you're exhausted." "I'm fine," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. A few minutes later, his chin dropped again. This time, it stayed there longer. Elizabeth did not wait for another near miss. "Pull over," she said. "I'll drive." He scoffed, annoyed more by the suggestion than the danger. "It's nothing. I didn't sleep well, that's all." "You're falling asleep," she replied, keeping her tone steady. "I have my license. Let me take over." For a moment, it looked like he might argue. Then, with an irritated exhale, he signaled and pulled onto the shoulder. They switched seats in silence. Mark climbed into the back without another word, stretched out awkwardly, and almost immediately closed his eyes. Within minutes, he was asleep. Elizabeth adjusted the mirrors and pulled back onto the highway. The road ahead was long and nearly empty, framed by trees already stripped thin by early autumn. The sky hung low and colorless. The air felt sharper, colder, as if winter were testing its reach. She drove carefully, more slowly than Mark had, aware of every sound the car made. The steady hum of the tires, the faint rattle from the dashboard, Mark's uneven breathing behind her. Responsibility settled into her shoulders, familiar yet heavier, now that she was fully alert and alone at the wheel. The silence sharpened her focus. There was no conversation to distract her, no radio playing softly in the background, just the road stretching forward in a pale ribbon. Then she saw it. At first it was only a shape near the edge of the pavement, small and unmoving. Elizabeth eased off the accelerator, her eyes narrowing as the distance closed. The shape resolved into a child, a boy, standing alone on the shoulder of the highway, his thin jacket pulled tight against the cold. Her heart jolted. This was no longer about the quiet tension between husband and wife. Something else had entered their path, sudden and unmistakable, and Elizabeth knew instinctively that the drive had already changed course. Elizabeth slowed the car until it rolled almost silently along the shoulder. The boy stood with his hands tucked into the sleeves of a jacket that was far too thin for the weather. He looked no older than 10. His shoulders were hunched, his posture stiff, as if he had been standing there for a long time, afraid to move. For a brief moment, Elizabeth hesitated. She was alone in the front seat, with her husband asleep behind her. The road was empty, the nearest exit miles away. She told herself to think carefully, to weigh the risks the way sensible people did. Then the boy lifted his head and met her eyes. That was enough. Elizabeth pulled over and lowered the window. "Are you all right?" she asked. He nodded quickly, though his teeth were chattering. "Yes, I'm just cold." "Where are you headed?" "The hospital," he said. "The one off the highway." Elizabeth glanced at the empty road again. "Get in," she said. "You shouldn't be standing out here." He hesitated only a second before opening the door and climbing into the passenger seat. Up close, she could see how pale he was, how red his hands had become from the cold. As the door closed, warm air filled the space between them, and he let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a long time. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I don't have any money." "That's fine," Elizabeth replied. "You don't need any. What's your name?" "Noah. Noah Reynolds." "I'm Elizabeth," she said, easing the car back onto the road. "Why are you going to the hospital alone?" "My grandma's there," Noah answered. "They took her in an ambulance this morning. She got really sick." Elizabeth nodded, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. "And your parents?" Noah shook his head. "It's just me and her. My parents died a long time ago. I don't really remember them." As he spoke, his eyes kept shifting past Elizabeth, flicking toward the back seat. Each time Mark's breathing grew louder, Noah stiffened slightly, his gaze snapping forward again as if he had been caught doing something wrong. Elizabeth noticed, but didn't comment. "Don't worry," she said gently. "We'll get you there." Noah nodded, though his shoulders remained tense. "I thought maybe someone would stop," he said. "I've been waiting a while." "You're safe now," Elizabeth replied, meaning it. She did not yet understand why his fear felt so specific, so directed. To her, he was simply a child alone on a cold road, trying to reach the only family he had left. She told herself that was all there was to it. For now, compassion was enough. The warmth inside the car slowly eased the tension in Noah's shoulders, but it did not make him relaxed. He sat upright, hands folded tightly in his lap, eyes fixed on the road ahead. After a few minutes, Elizabeth asked gently how long he had lived with his grandmother. "Since my parents died," he said. "It's just been the two of us for years." He spoke without drama, as if he had learned early not to expect sympathy. Elizabeth waited, letting the silence give him space. "They died in an accident," Noah added. "A long time ago." Elizabeth nodded. I'm sorry. He shrugged slightly, then glanced again toward the back seat. Mark's breathing had grown deeper, heavier. Noah's eyes lingered there longer this time, his expression tightening. Does he work near here? Noah asked suddenly. Elizabeth followed his gaze in the mirror. My husband? No. Why? Noah hesitated, then lowered his voice. He looks like a man who came to our village. Elizabeth's hand stilled on the wheel. What man? One who kept asking my grandma about the house, Noah said. He came more than once, not alone, sometimes with other people. Elizabeth felt a faint chill that had nothing to do with the weather. What did he want? To buy it, Noah replied. He said it would be easier for us, that the house was old, too much work. He talked a lot about papers and money. And your grandmother? She didn't want to sell. Noah swallowed. She told him no, every time. The road hummed beneath them. Elizabeth forced herself to keep her eyes forward. What happened then? Noah's voice dropped. He said that if something happened to my grandma, he would make sure I was taken care of, that I'd be placed in a good shelter, with food and warm beds. Elizabeth's stomach tightened. Did he say that to you? Yes, Noah said. He smiled when he did. Elizabeth said nothing for a moment. The words settled heavily in the car, pressing against her thoughts. She told herself there were explanations, coincidences. That fear could distort memory, especially in a child who had lost so much. You're sure it was him? She asked carefully. Noah looked at Mark again, then shook his head. I don't know. Maybe not. He just looks like him. Before Elizabeth could respond, Mark shifted in the back seat. He let out a rough breath and sat up, rubbing his face. Are we there yet? He asked, his voice thick with sleep. Elizabeth glanced at Noah. The boy had gone quiet, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Almost, she said evenly, easing her foot off the accelerator. The conversation ended there, unfinished. But the seed had already been planted, and Elizabeth could not shake the feeling that something she did not yet understand had just brushed dangerously close. Mark's eyes sharpened the moment he fully registered Noah in the front seat. His posture shifted, irritation replacing the grogginess almost instantly. What's this? He demanded. Why is there a kid in the car? Elizabeth answered calmly. He's going to the hospital. His grandmother was taken there this morning. Mark let out a short, humorless laugh. And that's our problem. How? He was standing on the highway, Elizabeth said. Alone. So? Mark snapped. That doesn't mean you pick him up. Do you have any idea how stupid that is? Elizabeth tightened her grip on the wheel. I'm not leaving him on the side of the road. Pull over, Mark said sharply. Let him out at the next exit. No. The word came out quietly, but it landed with unexpected weight. Mark stared at her, clearly unaccustomed to hearing it. I'm taking him to the hospital, Elizabeth continued. We're almost there. Mark scoffed. Unbelievable. You believe every sad story someone throws at you. Kids like that know exactly what they're doing. Elizabeth did not respond. She kept her eyes on the road and followed the signs toward the exit. Mark muttered under his breath, his annoyance filling the space between them, but he did not stop her. The hospital rose ahead of them, gray and impersonal against the cold sky. Elizabeth pulled into the lot and parked near the entrance. She turned to Noah. This is it, she said. Come on. Noah hesitated, then nodded. Elizabeth stepped out with him and walked him through the sliding doors into the bright, sterile lobby. She helped him speak to the front desk, waited until he was directed down the hall, then pressed a small piece of paper into his hand. That's my number, she said. Call me later. Let me know how your grandmother is. Noah looked at the paper, then back at her. Thank you, he said softly. Elizabeth watched until he disappeared from view before returning to the car. Mark was waiting, arms crossed, jaw tight. So, he said as she slid into the driver's seat, you feel better now? Did your good deed for the day? He needed help, Elizabeth replied. Mark shook his head. He played you. You'll see. They all do. Tears, stories, the whole act. Elizabeth said nothing. She started the engine and pulled out of the lot. Escalation would lead nowhere. She had learned that long ago. But as the hospital faded behind them, Elizabeth felt something shift inside her. For the first time, she had not yielded. She had chosen differently, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. They arrived at Helen Bennett's house just before midday. The place looked exactly as Elizabeth remembered it, neat, quiet, preserved in a kind of careful stillness. Helen greeted them warmly enough, asking about the drive, offering tea, moving through familiar routines without lingering on emotion. Not long after, she suggested they go to the cemetery while the daylight held. Mark's father's grave needed cleaning before winter set in. Without discussion, they all agreed. The cemetery lay only a short drive away. The air there felt colder, sharper, carrying the smell of damp earth and fallen leaves. Elizabeth walked beside Helen along the narrow paths between headstones, Mark a few steps ahead. The silence was broken only by the sound of gravel underfoot. As they approached Mark's father's grave, Elizabeth's gaze drifted, catching on names and dates carved into stone. Then she stopped. A few rows away stood a double grave. The surname carved across the top read Reynolds. Elizabeth felt her breath catch. She stepped closer, reading the inscriptions. 2 names, a man and a woman, both young. The dates beneath them were identical, the same day, the same year. For a moment, the cemetery seemed to tilt, as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted. "Helen," Elizabeth asked quietly, "do you know who they were?" Helen followed her gaze and sighed. "That? Yes, it was a long time ago, a car accident." "When?" "About 10 years back," Helen replied. "Tragic thing. Young couple. Left a child behind from what people said." Elizabeth's heart began to pound. "What happened?" Helen shrugged, lowering her voice. "A wealthy man was involved. Fancy car. They said he was responsible, but nothing ever came of it. Either he disappeared or the whole thing was covered up. No one was held accountable." Before Elizabeth could ask more, Mark turned sharply. "What are you two whispering about?" he demanded. "Just old stories," Helen said quickly. "Nothing important." Mark's jaw tightened. "Why dig that up now? They're dead. What difference does it make?" The irritation in his voice was unmistakable. He turned away, kneeling beside his father's grave and beginning to clear away leaves with abrupt, forceful movements. Elizabeth said nothing more, but her mind was racing. The surname, the timing, Noah's story, his parents, the accident. She looked back at the double grave once more, the carved letters cold and permanent, then forced herself to follow Mark. As they finished tending the grave and prepared to leave, Elizabeth felt the weight of the past pressing into the present. What had once seemed like a collection of unrelated moments now aligned with unsettling clarity. The road they had traveled that morning no longer felt accidental, and Elizabeth knew, with a certainty she could not yet explain, that the truth she was circling would not allow itself to remain buried. Elizabeth woke to the sound of Mark's voice. At first she thought she was dreaming, fragments of words slipping into consciousness without shape. Then she realized the bed beside her was empty. The house was quiet except for the low murmur coming from the hallway. She lay still, listening. Mark was on the phone. "I know," he was saying, his voice tight, stripped of its usual irritation. "I know it was buried, but things like this don't just stay buried forever." Elizabeth's pulse quickened. She sat up slowly, careful not to make a sound. "No, I'm not panicking," Mark continued. "I'm just saying, if someone starts asking questions, it could all come back. Everything." There was a pause. Elizabeth could hear another voice through the receiver, indistinct but firm. "Yes, that accident," Mark said. "Of course I remember. How could I forget? I just don't want any surprises." Another pause. His voice dropped lower. "If it comes out, They won't stop at you. They'll look at everyone involved. Elizabeth pressed, her hand to her mouth. Her breath felt too loud in the silence. "All right," Mark finished sharply. "I'm not saying more over the phone." The call ended. Elizabeth lay back down, staring at the ceiling as Mark returned to bed beside her. He fell asleep quickly, as if the conversation had drained whatever tension remained in him. Elizabeth did not sleep at all. Morning came gray and slow. She waited until Helen had gone out to tend to the garden before speaking. "What accident were you talking about last night?" Elizabeth asked quietly. Mark froze. For a split second, his expression betrayed him. Surprise, then calculation. "You were listening?" "I woke up," she replied. "You weren't exactly whispering." He sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "You shouldn't have heard that." "But I did." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Mark exhaled and leaned back in his chair. "Fine. You want the truth? My boss, Thomas Caldwell, was driving drunk years ago, that night." Elizabeth felt the room tilt. "The accident, the one that killed Noah's parents." Mark nodded once. "Yes. And you?" "I was there," he said. "I worked for him then. I drove him most of the time. That night, he insisted on driving himself." Elizabeth's voice shook. "And you let him?" "I didn't have a choice," Mark snapped. "Do you have any idea who he was? What power he had?" He continued before she could respond. "He hit them, killed them instantly, and then he looked at me and told me what would happen if the truth came out." Elizabeth stared at him. "So you lied." "I protected him," Mark corrected. "And in return, he protected me, promoted me, helped us buy our house, gave us a life we never would have had otherwise." "You traded 2 lives for comfort," Elizabeth said softly. Mark's face hardened. "I did what I had to do. There was no other way. You think the truth would have fixed anything? It wouldn't bring them back." The words landed like a final blow. Elizabeth understood then that something fundamental had broken between them, not in anger, not in shouting, but in the calm certainty that they no longer stood on the same side of what was right. Elizabeth did not respond to Mark's explanation. She did not argue, did not raise her voice, did not try to convince him of anything. There was nothing left to debate. The truth had settled too deeply for words to dislodge it. Noah Reynolds was not an abstract tragedy. He was a child with a thin jacket and trembling hands, a boy who stood on the shoulder of a highway because there was no one else to stand for him. Elizabeth saw the line clearly now. The accident, the double grave, the pressure to sell the house, the promise of a good shelter, the careful watching from a distance, all of it led back to the same moment, back to the night Mark and his boss chose silence over accountability. She sat alone in the guest room, staring at the wall, trying to imagine how a life could be built on something like that. Her own life, the house they lived in, the stability she had accepted without question. Every comfort suddenly felt heavy, tainted by the cost paid by people who had never been given a choice. Her phone rang. Elizabeth flinched, then answered. It was Noah. His voice broke as soon as she said his name. "They won't let me see her," he cried. "She's in a coma. They said she might not wake up." Elizabeth closed her eyes. "Where are you right now?" "At the hospital," he said. "I'm sitting outside. They told me to wait." She did not tell Mark where she was going. She did not leave a note or offer an explanation. Some decisions did not allow for delay or permission. She took her coat and keys and drove back toward the city, her hands steady on the wheel despite the storm inside her chest. The hospital corridor outside the ICU was brightly lit and painfully quiet. Noah sat alone on a plastic chair, his feet not quite reaching the floor. His shoulders shook silently as he pressed his face into his hands. Elizabeth crossed the distance in a few steps and knelt in front of him. "Noah," she said softly. He looked up, startled, then stood and wrapped his arms around her without hesitation. Elizabeth held him, feeling how light he was, how easily he fit against her. "I didn't know who else to call," he whispered. "You did the right thing," she said. I'm here." A young doctor stood a short distance away, watching them with concern. He approached carefully. "I'm Dr. Samuel Wright," he said. "I've been keeping an eye on him. He shouldn't be alone like this." Elizabeth straightened. "Thank you." Dr. Wright nodded. "His grandmother's condition is serious. We're doing everything we can." Elizabeth placed a hand on Noah's shoulder. In that moment, she understood something with painful clarity. This was no longer about uncovering truth or assigning blame. It was about what happened next. And for the first time since the night before, Elizabeth did not feel uncertain. She felt resolved. Elizabeth took Noah home with her that night. When the nurse asked who she was, Elizabeth did not hesitate. She said she was family, a relative by marriage, and gave her name calmly, steadily. Noah stayed close to her side, gripping the sleeve of her coat as if letting go might cause everything to disappear. No one stopped them. No one asked for proof. The hospital was busy, understaffed, and already stretched thin. At Helen's house, Noah slept on the couch, curled tightly beneath a blanket. Elizabeth sat nearby long after the lights were turned off, listening to his breathing, aware that the steps she had taken could not be undone. Dr. Samuel Wright did not forget what he had seen. The next morning, questions began to surface. Noah's absence was noted. The chart flagged inconsistencies. A supervisor asked where the boy had gone and why he had been released to someone without documentation. Dr. Wright accepted the reprimand, but unease settled into him. The reaction felt disproportionate, defensive, as if someone was afraid of scrutiny. When he began asking quiet questions, the answers came too quickly, too smoothly. He learned that instructions regarding Noah's grandmother had come from higher up, that her case had been marked for observation, that certain updates were being shared outside standard channels. The name attached to those requests led to Thomas Caldwell. Dr. Wright reached out to Elizabeth that afternoon. When she told him what she knew, the accident, the cover-up, the pressure on Noah's grandmother, the pieces aligned with grim clarity. This was no coincidence. It was containment. Caldwell did not want the past disturbed. Dr. Wright arranged a meeting under the pretense of seeking guidance. He brought a recorder with him, hidden but active, trusting instinct over protocol. Elizabeth, unwilling to stand back any longer, contacted the police and explained what she suspected. She was told to wait, to stay available. Caldwell arrived with confidence intact, dressed impeccably, smiling as if nothing in the world could touch him. At first, he spoke vaguely, dismissively. Accidents happened. People misremembered. The past was settled. Then Dr. Wright pressed. The smile vanished. Caldwell's voice hardened as he warned him to stop digging. He hinted at consequences, careers ruined, lives destabilized. He stepped closer, lowering his tone, and in doing so, revealed more than he intended. Enough to confirm intent, enough to expose fear. He never noticed the recorder. When Caldwell realized the meeting was not unfolding on his terms, he made a call. That was when the police intervened. They arrived swiftly, decisively. Caldwell's associates were detained. His attempt to silence a witness added a new charge to a growing list. The recording was secured. The old accident reopened. Mark Bennett was brought in the same day. Financial records followed. Promotions explained. Loans traced. His perjury surfaced alongside other violations he had assumed would remain buried. He reacted with fury, directing it at Elizabeth, accusing her of betrayal. She did not respond. As Caldwell was led away in handcuffs, Elizabeth stood at a distance, Noah beside her. Justice had not come gently, but it had come at last, and this time it did not stop halfway. Mark blamed Elizabeth for everything that followed. He did not argue the facts or deny what he had done. He simply redirected his anger, accusing her of destroying the life they had built. When she told him she was filing for divorce, he did not resist. There were no apologies, no attempts at reconciliation. Whatever had bound them together had already collapsed long before the truth came out. Helen listened in silence when Elizabeth explained what had happened. She did not raise her voice or defend her son. Her disappointment was quiet, heavy, and unmistakable. "I can't abandon him," Helen said at last, "but I won't excuse him either. What he did was wrong." Elizabeth accepted that. Some reckonings were private, carried alone. With Mark gone, Elizabeth turned her attention to Noah. The legal process was slow and procedural, filled with paperwork, interviews, and evaluations. She complied with every requirement, answered every question honestly. She did not frame herself as a savior or a hero. She simply stated the truth. The boy had no one else, and she was willing to take responsibility. Noah's grandmother passed away before the process was complete. The news came quietly, without drama, delivered by a nurse who had done this too many times to soften the words. Noah cried in Elizabeth's arms, his grief raw and unguarded. Elizabeth held him, knowing there was nothing she could say to make it better, only her presence to make it bearable. Dr. Samuel Wright remained close through it all. What began as coordination and concern slowly became something steadier. They shared late conversations about Noah's needs, difficult days, small victories. Neither rushed the change in their relationship. Trust formed first, built through responsibility rather than romance. When the divorce was finalized and Noah's guardianship approved, Elizabeth felt a sense of closure she had not expected. It was not relief, it was alignment. The feeling that her life no longer stood in contradiction to her values. Elizabeth and Dr. Wright married quietly, without spectacle. Soon after, the adoption was finalized. Noah took Elizabeth's last name, the change marked by a simple signature and a long-held breath finally released. A year later, their daughter was born. They named her Margaret in honor of the grandmother who had loved Noah fiercely and protected him for as long as she could. Life did not erase what had happened. The past remained where it belonged, acknowledged, remembered, and faced, but it no longer dictated the future. Justice had not restored what was lost. It had done something quieter and more lasting. It had broken the cycle, and that, Elizabeth knew, was enough.